Okay, hi, welcome. This won't be as rigorous as the exercise we just had. It's okay, but that was excellent. Okay, so today we're going to talk about an actual case study using some of our tools, and we'll try to think a little bit differently about how we use our tools. And in order to start that, I want you to just listen for a minute. So I don't know if you recognize what that was besides the map, but that was the Met, excuse me, but that was actually Julia Landsman on the French horn. And I had the pleasure of meeting Malcolm Gladwell at the airport in the security line on the way back from TMRE last summer. And in his book, Blink, he talks about Julia and her audition for the orchestra. And when she auditioned, they had screens because someone else trying out had a parent in the orchestra. And the reason that she got accepted was because of the screens, because of the anonymity of the experience. And previously, women hadn't been accepted into orchestras. And what happened as a result is it changed the face of orchestras. They became more diverse. They did things a little bit differently and included members that hadn't been there before. So we're going to use that premise to think about. One of the best examples, or the most famous, is the blind taste test of Coke and Pepsi, but that notion of anonymity and how we apply that. Now, many of our clients, and we work with many of the consumer product companies and pharma companies, they live in a world of focus groups and IDIs, especially in the pharma space. And some of them are doing bulletin boards and things like that. However, patients are doing this, right? And they're doing this. And they're communicating in images, and they're using different kinds of techniques and different kinds of social aspects to communicate, and that is somewhat of a threat probably to market research, but there's ways to kind of bridge that we'll talk about today. So at BuzzBack, we develop a range of tools, and one thing I heard in the previous session, I think Diane had mentioned it from Communispace, is that we can't just give clients the tools. It's really about the applications, because that's their world. When they go back to their desk and they have an issue with packaging or whatever it might be, they need a way to connect the tools. And so we tried to do that in this study, which is a pharma example. Now, when we develop our tools at BuzzBack, as you probably saw, we place a huge emphasis on visuals. And the reason that we do that is that people don't think in text, right? You know, you're probably familiar with Zaltman and some of the other folks out there. Decision making happens in the subconscious, more than 80%. What's super interesting on top of that is in the pharma space, when a patient is diagnosed with a disease, normally that patient forgets 80% of what the doctor told him or her. And when you use visuals to help connect, it actually flips the percentage, so the patient retains more. So the use of visuals really help us get below the surface and open up in different ways. And online, you know, that kind of gives us a whole new realm and world to think about. So about a year ago, I was here in the UK. I'm from New York, actually, and I met with a client, and when I showed her our online forum, she said, wouldn't it be really neat if we had doctors and patients together in one forum? You know, what would happen if we changed the space and made it anonymous? Would we get different results, and what would we actually learn?
Oh, well, about 3 years ago, I found out that I'm getting old. Shortness of breath is taking me down. I used to subscribe to Falcon's hockey team, and we went every week. But I found out when coming out of there, I had to start wearing a scarf over my mouth because I couldn't breathe the cold air in. And I had to say, hey girls, wait for me. It's like I'm walking behind, you know, like in that old movie, The Sullivan Boys, wait for me. So they said, we're walking okay, we're not running. I said, well, yes you are. So they start walking a little slower to accommodate me. And then once I got in the car, I had to go huffing and puffing. But of course, back in those days, I didn't know anything about personal breathing, so I used to go, they used to all get scared. Should we go to the hospital or something?
So let's just call her Mary. This is a very typical, what I would call, patient interview. Mary has COPD, and our pharma clients do this all the time, right? They have IDIs and they talk with patients, and this is typically what they get. It's Mary talking about her symptoms, and Mary focusing on what it's like breathing and trying to change how she lives. In our forum, we did something a little bit different. We had 2 logins. A lot of times we do 2 or 3. It's a short-term community. And the difference with our forum, we built our own technology, is that we've integrated our tools. So things like Collage and Scene Builder and Thought Bubble, a couple which I'll show you today, are integrated into the forum so that we can help open people up. So in the first session, we had doctors and patients, and then we split the sessions and had the doctors and patients separately. We had about 20 patients, sufferers of COPD. We have several clients who are developing medications for COPD, and that was why we picked that topic. Additionally, we had about 15 doctors who treat patients the same. And what we typically do in these sessions is, like Qual, we have a warm-up exercise. And as you can see, it's pretty vanilla. When we do normal consumer studies, we have photos, and we sometimes bring in their Facebook data and do different kinds of ways to integrate with consumers. But in the pharma world, you can't do that. It has to be very private, very anonymous in terms of who the participants are. So we had the patients, and we met the doctors. And then we had them do a collage exercise. This is one of the techniques that we have at BuzzBack. We've won lots of awards for it. And essentially, what happens is the respondent is asked to build a collage. In this case, they were asked to build a collage that expressed how they felt living with COPD. And the doctors had to project how the patients felt. The images are custom to the question. So we actually work with our clients to select the images, and there's a science behind that in terms of having a range of images. But remember, the purpose of the images is to help people open up and talk, right? And they spend about 10-15 minutes building their collage, and then we ask them to describe it. So this is an example of a patient collage. And hopefully what you see here as you read the verbatim, because it is quite rich, is that the patient talks about how they feel, how it's fatiguing, how it's burdensome, how it's really different. It's not about the shortness of breath so much. It's really about how that patient feels. Same with the doctor. The doctor is projecting, very different than what we saw with Mary, right? Mary focused on her symptoms. She never really talked about how she felt and what it was like emotionally living with COPD. And we typically have the individual collages that we incorporate. We also have a collaborative approach that we can do within the forum because it is a forum environment. And when we look at the reporting, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, in this case qualitative, we can actually look at the images as a summary. So what you see on the left is an image cloud, much like a word cloud, where the bigger the image, the more frequently it's used, right? And that gives us a bit of a picture about how people are actually feeling and what the burdens are really like. Additionally, in this study, we did linguistic analysis. So we looked at not just those verbatims of what people said, but how they express themselves. And the reason that we do that, it's called language and behavior analysis. The reason that we do that is so that we can find that language, we can find those words that we then put in our ads, because that immediately is common ground to talk to the client, for the client to talk to the patient or the respondent or the doctor, as it may be. So you want to adopt that language. And in this study, we saw 3 patterns that were really dominant. The feel pattern, the away from, and the do. So the feel is like being burdened, the heaviest weight in the world. And these are some of the words that people used in their collages. And typically we do this kind of analysis on a collage exercise. And then also what they want to do to quit, right? So it is a bit around their goals and what they want to achieve at the end of the day. Additionally, we have, other projective techniques that we integrate. This is a thought bubble, one you're probably used to using in Qual. You give somebody a visual scenario and you ask them to talk about it in a third party because you get a different kind of response, much like we saw with Collage. And you get all the verbatims. And I'm not going to go through this in a ton of detail, but this is the kind of language that gives us the insight that helps kind of foster what we're doing going forward. We also had some ideation exercises around the perfect treatment, of course the once-a-day pill, sharing perspectives, and where these folks get their new information. And part of the reason I show this, because it's not very different, is that you don't have to compromise what you typically do in your studies, right? You can still integrate that, but now you can layer on this whole other emotional dimension that wasn't there before. And then finally, and this was kind of the reason that we did this study in the first place, what we discovered is that there really is a new kind of relationship. That anonymity, that Gladwell talked about, fosters a different kind of relationship between the patient and the doctor. So the patients welcome the dialogue. The doctors saw it as non-threatening. It's not my patient. I can talk to them more openly. There aren't the same barriers there. So we actually did kind of see what we were looking for. And then typically what we would try to do is talk about the implications with clients, right? So nothing new here, essentially in terms of, what they focus on, how they feel. We would summarize that. But what happens in pharma studies quite a bit is that clients are focused more on the outcomes. When they talk about their medication, it's about what the medication is going to do, how much better the patient's going to feel. When really, a lot of times, they need to relate to what the burdens are. And relating and closing the gap between what doctors and patients say are the burdens, in this case around COPD. So one of the examples I think that does that well is the Spiriva ads. And you can see here, this is a COPD medication, how the elephant is a great symbol of how these people really feel, right? So they've captured it here and expressed it in a totally different way. So hopefully in this case study, we've given you some sense of how you can get beneath the surface and using different kinds of tools and questions, but remember to bring it back to the application. And also how that notion of anonymity really changes the space, right? And thinking about things a little bit differently in terms of the approach. Thank you.